to how this would be received, but this is a very overwhelming response, so thank you. I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm meeting on and we're meeting on today. And I'm connecting in from the lands of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and that sovereignty was never ceded. My name is Anthony Bigelow. I am the convener for the Victoria Environment Friends Network, which is based here in Victoria. We're an entirely volunteer-based organisation, and we're supporting over 170 friends of and conservation groups across the state, which represents about 16,000 conservation volunteers doing extraordinary things all across our beautiful state to support their local environment. A little bit of housekeeping. This seminar is being recorded, so we will be able to share this link after the meeting tonight. What we're thinking of doing is, if you have any questions, please just put them into chat, and both Jessica and myself will collate that and then pass it on at the end of Jake's presentation tonight, and as I say, go from there. But look, without further ado, I would like to welcome our special guest this evening, Dr. Jake Robinson. Jake is a microbial, restoration. Sorry, Jake, fumbled on that word.
Okay.
Thank you. And restoration ecologist at Flinders University. He explores the deep connections between biodiversity and human health, and is pioneering new tools to help restore nature. And very specifically, he's also an author of 3 popular science books: The Invisible Friends, Treewilding, and The Forthcoming Nature of Pandemics. So at this point, Jake, we are in your hands. Please entertain, enthrall, and educate us.
Thank you. Pressure's on. Cheers, Anthony. Yeah, so I'd like to just acknowledge that I'm speaking from the lands of the Kaurna people in Adelaide, also known as Tondanya, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging as well, and also show my appreciation for their kind of deep relationship with the land and the soil, which is the main topic of this talk. So I'm going to be talking about urban soil biodiversity. So just a quick one of who I am. So I'm a microbial ecologist and a restoration ecologist. So the first part means I study microorganisms in the environment, so things like bacteria and viruses and fungi, etc., and how they interact and influence human health, but in beneficial ways rather than, disease-causing ways. And then the second part, as Anthony says, is I kind of develop ways to restore damaged and degraded ecosystems. So I've studied quite a few different kinds of topics. So my work is quite multidisciplinary, and this will probably come out in the talk as well. I'm currently based at Flinders University, South Australia, as you probably all know. And as Anthony said, I've written 3 books. So they're on kind of restoration and also microbes and human health. And the forthcoming one is about pandemics, actually, and how to restore ecosystems to prevent pandemics. Okay, so let's get into the talk. So what are soils? Good starting point. So soils are the foundations of terrestrial life. So they're conglomerates of both abiotic, so non-living, and biotic components. So these are living components that form dynamic ecosystems. So I'm just going to minimize this screen here. So they're inherently relational. So many people think of soils as this kind of inert material, but it's absolutely full of life and lots of different interactions occurring between those life forms in the soils. Okay, so a bit of a controversial topic. Are soils alive? So as I've mentioned, absolutely heaving with organisms. So as I said, there's biological, physical and chemical components which form soil. And of the living parts, there are 99.9% of the planet's species that actually live in the soil up to. So some suggestions are around 60%, but there's a latest one here that suggests that up to 99% of all the species on the planet live in the soil ecosystems. So there are many soil animals that contribute to diverse ecological functions in the soil. So, things like snails and beetles and ants and worms, etc. All these kind of form complex food chains as well in the soils. So there's lots of things going on there on the animal level. And there's this nice snappy statistic here, or phrase here, if earthworms were a country, they'd be the 4th largest producer of grains. So earthworms are responsible for something like 7% of grain production in the world, just from their, the functional roles that they play in the soils. So things like aeration and nutrient cycling, etc. Okay, so moving on to the microorganisms. So this is more my area, so studying microbes such as bacteria and fungi, etc. So I'm just going to introduce you to a few of those that live in the soils now. So bacteria, you probably all know what they are. Archaea as well, so they're quite similar to bacteria, although it's actually a different domain of life. And they often occur in so-called extreme environments. So they're called extremophiles. So you'll find them in the hot springs, but they're also very prevalent in soils and in our own bodies as well. Fungi as well. So many people think of the huge mushrooms you might see in a woodland or a shop, but actually many, if not most, fungal species are actually invisible or near invisible. Algae as well. So again, you might think of the big green slimy stuff, the seaweed, etc. But many algae are near invisible as well, and these live in the mostly in the top layers of soil because they photosynthesize. And the algae actually secrete really important polysaccharides, sugary substances that contribute to the what's called aggregation of the soil. So they play a really important role in things like preventing soil erosion. Then we have protozoa in the middle. So you can think of proto as the first, or prototype, and then zoa refers to animal. So it's a kind of first animal-like organisms. They're not actually animals though. So these are abundant in soils as well, and these feed on things like bacteria as well. So these play an important role in the food chain. And then viruses as well. So absolutely loads of viruses living in the soils. Same as they live in our own bodies as well. So, we've got each one of you watching this has 380 trillion phage viruses inside you right now at any given moment. But many of them are actually playing really important roles in maintaining the biological equilibrium in our ecosystem. So again, they play roles such as, keeping bacteria in check, for instance. So although some viruses cause, nasty diseases, and we've lived through a pandemic, etc., many of them are actually playing important roles in keeping us healthy and our soils healthy as well. So lots of different kinds of microorganisms, all sorts of different shapes and sizes. So the top one in the middle, that's what's known as a bacteriophage. And again, that's one of those viruses that kind of hunts down bacteria. So the same kind of predator-prey dynamics that occur. For instance, you can think of a lion hunting down an antelope. These kind of same dynamics occur in the invisible world as well. So all sorts of things going on at the invisible level in the soil. So the top right is a tardigrade. This is also known as a moss piglet or a water bear. So some people find them quite cute. These live in mosses and lichens, etc. And then the one in the middle, for instance, is a bacteria again. This is what's known as a geobacterbacterium. And this lives deep down in the mud in anaerobic conditions, so where there's not much oxygen. And this can actually generate its own electricity through these what are called protein nanowires that are coming off its body. So lots of different life forms in the soils that we just don't really think about. I just want to illustrate the size difference of microorganisms. So I think we kind of normalize microorganisms at this kind of, they're all a kind of similar size, don't we? Very, very small. We can't see them. This little speck on the screen represents a virus. And this represents a bacterium. And actually, the largest bacterium is 37,500 times bigger than the smallest virus. So the size difference between all these organisms is absolutely enormous. And just to illustrate this further, this is exactly the same as comparing a single poppy seed, so one of these black specks on this muffin here, with a blue whale. So absolutely mind-blowing, the size difference of microorganisms that live in the soil, but also your own bodies. And that's all of these animals combined. So I just want to say this phrase, I often use this: all the nature we can see intimately depends upon all the nature we can't see. So here's my very rubbish artwork here. It's just showing kind of visible things that you might see in nature. So soil, grass, a tree, an animal, for instance. So everything we can see with the visible naked eye, intimately depends upon relationships with these microorganisms in the invisible world. So if you had microscope specs, you would see something a bit more like this. So microorganisms are absolutely everywhere, and they're particularly dense in the soils as well. And so microorganisms kind of from the soil, they feed the air as well. So this is probably the least accurate part of this image, these big empty spaces in the middle, because the air column is absolutely heaving with microbes as well, which are kind of fed by the soil. So actually this would be a more accurate representation of what you'd see with those microscopic specks on. So microbes are absolutely everywhere, particularly in the soil. So much as you can view yourself as this kind of walking ecosystem of life, so you're a host, what we call a holobiont, you're a host plus trillions of microorganisms working symbiotically to form this functioning ecological unit. You can view other things that are more deeply attached to the soil as well in the same way. So let's imagine a tree, for instance. We can view a tree in exactly the same way. So a tree is also a holobiont. So there's so much going on beneath a tree that's keeping the tree alive. Never mind the structural importance of soil. So without the soil, the tree wouldn't be able to stand up. There's so much life going on beneath the soil, beneath the tree, sorry, in the soil that's keeping the tree alive. So lots of microbes are playing important roles in providing chemicals to keep the tree healthy, prevent diseases, increase nutrient absorption, all these kind of things. And lots of other animals are playing a key role as well, lots of invertebrates. So just got to think of a tree as not this kind of individual entity, it's this community of life, really. Just to illustrate that point more, so take a 5-ton tree, for instance. So there's 6.1 trillion living cells in an average 5-ton tree. These are the tree's metabolically active cells. And many say that only 1%, it's a very small percentage anyway, that of a mature tree is actually living at any given moment. So the entire heartwood can basically rot away or be struck by lightning, for instance, and burn away. But the tree is very much still alive. So a small proportion of the tree is living, and of those cells, there are 6.1 trillion-ish in an average 5-ton tree. This is just a nice image from my childhood, actually. So I remember this ash tree got struck by lightning, this Fraxinus excelsior. And this was actually 30 years ago when it got struck by lightning. This photo was sent to me just a few weeks ago by my mum. So the tree's actually very much still thriving and surviving, even though the entire heartwood was destroyed. So now I want you to view this tree that's plugged into the ground as a holobiont. So it's this community of life. So a new article in Science said that more than 1 trillion bacteria live inside the tree trunk alone. And these are fed by the soil. And if we take into consideration the leaves inside and out, and the branches and the seeds and the roots, etc., then a tree actually hosts between 15.1 trillion and 115 quadrillion bacteria. So absolutely mind-blowing numbers. But together, so the tree's metabolically active cells, plus the microbes that live in and on the tree, these form this holobiont. So it's this kind of meta-community of life. So a tree is actually between 68.75 and 99.99% microbial. So you could say it's actually more invisible than it is visible. Now, if you were to take just a teaspoon of soil, so from around the tree, for instance, now just imagine we had the technology to line those microbes that lived in this teaspoon of soil, line them up in a row. If we were able to do that, they'd be able to wrap around the entire perimeter of the Amazon rainforest. That's just from one single teaspoon of soil. And actually, if you took the microbes from just one single tree, so a tree is a kind of, that community of life, and you were able to extract them and line them up, they'd be able to wrap around the perimeter of the Amazon rainforest 1,500 times over. So absolutely mind-blowing numbers. And you might say, okay, that's really interesting, but so what? I would say to that, it's awesome, that's so what? What do you mean? And you might say, okay, apart from it being awesome, so what? Well, I just want to draw your attention to this paper I published last year. It's called Food Webs and Food Webs. So this is also known as nested food webs. So it's this idea that, we have this traditional ecological food web where we have primary producers, so the plants, again, very much part of the soil as well. And then we have herbivores that feed on the plants, and then predators that feed on the herbivores, etc. And they form these kind of complex chains of trophic interactions. Now, if you just zoom into one of these nodes in the red circle, and then it becomes this big green circle, big blue circle, sorry. Now, this is actually a population of a given species within that traditional food web. It's a rabbit here, but it could be anything. It could be yourself. Now I'll zoom into that node, and then we have this big green circle here. And why this is important is because this is an individual within that population. And within each individual tree, anything that's relies on the soil, even ourselves, there are these microbial food webs inside of them. The interactions in these microbial food webs, they actually shape the health and the behavior of these individuals, which then kind of influences the entire ecosystem. So that's why it's really important. It's really complex, but it's really important to kind of move beyond just the, interesting numbers into the world of interactions. So some people are trying to influence food webs now. So this is my friend Heather Rumble. She's working on green roofs in urban areas, and it's really challenging to maintain the health of green roofs, particularly relating to the soil on the green roof as well. And she's actually inoculating the green roofs with particular bacteria, and she's shown that it can influence and enhance the soil food web. So it's improving populations of things like microinvertebrates as well, which rely on these microscopic organisms in the soil. So that's quite an interesting application of this food web's thinking. And just to illustrate one of those dynamics in the microscopic food web, so a microbial food web, this is a really cool statistic. So every 48 hours, half of all the bacteria on the entire planet are killed by phage viruses. Let that sink in for a moment. Mind-blowing numbers again. And actually, these kind of like spider-like space lunar lander kind of things, but there are all sorts of different shapes and sizes as well, as you can see above. These are viruses. So we kind of talked about numbers and we talked about interactions, but what's going on in the soil as well. So these microorganisms and all these tiny little animals, tiny little invertebrates, etc., they form parts of the food web in the soil. But they also play really important functional roles in keeping the rest of the ecosystem really healthy. So, for instance, microbes and animals in the soil play key roles in decomposition and nutrient cycling. I mentioned earlier that algae and other organisms as well, they play an important role in soil aggregation. So that's kind of clumping soil particles together. And this influences things like water infiltration, but also, as I mentioned, preventing soil erosion as well. Microorganisms they cause diseases, but many of them actually prevent them and help the plants that are plugged into the soil again to fight off diseases. Many microbes produce phytohormones, so special chemicals that keep plants healthy. So millions of these in the soil beneath plant roots. Mycorrhizal fungi, I'll talk about those a little bit in a moment. And sort of abiotic things as well, so non-living things, so things like salinity regulation. These are all happening at the hands of all these different kinds of organisms that are living in the urban soils and all soils, really. So this is a nice headline. Well, it's not nice, but it's kind of stark. So the trees in our cities are dying. A sick microbiome might be to blame. So something like 40% of urban trees that are planted die within the first few years of life. And I think this one of the reasons, I mean, there are several reasons, things like poor irrigation and, damage and etc., compaction. But I think one of the main reasons is we're not viewing trees as these kind of meta-organisms. We're not viewing them as these holobionts that are really dependent on the soil as well and the organisms in the soil. So it's got to view it as a system rather than simply, planting ornaments in urban areas and hoping for the best. This is interesting as well. This points to more our kind of, the cultural view of soil. We do treat it like this kind of inert, dirty material. So in the UK in 2016, 58.7 million tons of soil was removed in urban areas, and 55% of the tonnage received in landfills was soil. That's kind of crazy, isn't it? So the majority of so-called waste going to landfills was actually soil. And so, soils and everything that depend on soils have to endure various novel kind of stresses at the moment. So, you've obviously got the urban heat island effect. So the urban areas are really heating up and climate change, etc. Artificial lights. So this paper points to artificial lights at night. So we're seeing this growing issue of light pollution and noise pollution as well. And this can impact on the soil and the soil microbiome as well. So the soil has to endure all sorts of different stresses, and the organisms in the soil, they play an important role in how the soil and the plants in the soil respond to these stresses. when we're restoring soil, we often have to go through this kind of three-step process. So before we think about, the organisms, the living things in the soil, such as the microbes, the animals, and the plants, we have to get the physical and the chemical components correct in the first place. So it's this kind of three-step process: the physical components, the materiality of the soil. Then you think about the nutrients, the chemicals of the soil, and then you can think about the things that live in the soil. And there's this idea of the field of dreams hypothesis, whereas if you get the physical and chemical components correct and in place, then life will find a way. That's the idea. This is very context dependent as well. So for instance, in a post-mining context, this is where the soils really is destroyed essentially. So it has to be reconstructed. So yeah, you come at this from a different point along that trajectory, depending on the restoration project and context. And then there's moving into this thinking of prebiotics and probiotics. So you can think of the gut microbiome. You think of probiotics that some people take in yogurts, for instance. And then so these are the good or the healthy bacteria that play important functional roles in your body. And then you need the prebiotics as well. So you need to feed these bacteria and various other microbes in your gut with fiber and diverse fruits and vegetables, etc. So my friend John Crine, he likes to say, you are what your microbes eat rather than you are what you eat. But we're applying the same kind of thinking to ecosystem restoration as well. So some people are working on things like microbial inoculants, where one approach is to take a whole soil sample from a thriving ecosystem and then implant it into a degraded ecosystem in the hope that it helps restore that system. That's quite damaging to the donor site. So we're kind of moving away from that thinking, and we're generating these microbial inoculants that are more liquid culture based that we're applying around soils and plants. And these inoculants they contain various different microbes that we think have an important role in the ecosystem. It's still very early days though, and it's quite a reactive approach as well. So we firstly try and promote more holistic approaches to soil restoration. But then again, as with the gut microbiome, the soil microbiome also needs the prebiotics, so the organic matter, compost, manure, humus, etc., in the soil. So it's a kind of similar thinking, which is not really surprising because human health should really be viewed as an ecological concept. So we are just another species in the ecosystem. Okay, so another controversial or thought-provoking question. So do soils think? Well, obviously soils don't have brains and brain regions, hippocampi, etc., but they do exhibit complex and self-organizing behaviors that resemble a form of decision-making. Now, there's this idea, again, quite controversial at the moment, hotly debated topic called the Wood Wide Web concept. So this is the idea that beneath a forest, for instance, there's this vast biological internet of, roots and mycelial networks, all interconnecting and kind of communicating with each other. And there's this idea that, trees are communicating with each other and warning them of danger and providing nutrients when other trees need it through this wood wide web. And someone who's popularized this concept is called, her name, sorry, is Professor Suzanne Simard. And I quite like her work, but she does come up to some criticism as well. So certain critics include Professor Toby Kears, and I like her work too. But she says, it's a bit more of an economic framing that we should be viewing this wood wide web. So she's not denying these complex systems occur. She's just questioning the interpretation of it, I think. So widely reported claims that trees use the wood wide web to signal danger, to recognize offspring, or to share nutrients with other trees is actually based on thin or misinterpreted evidence. And one of the main criticisms of the wood wide web concept is anthropomorphism. I'll get onto that in a sec. This is just an example of Toby Kears' work. So she's, one of her recent papers shows that fungi build dense highway systems to transport resources between themselves and plants with remarkable efficiency. And they adjust their network structures and flows and speeds, and they balance exploration and trade. So they essentially adjust their structures and flow speeds to determine whether and how much energy to put into transporting nutrients to trees. So the question of this kind of mutualistic relationship in the wood wide web, where trees are helping each other out and fungi and trees are in this kind of communal friendly relationship. That's the thing that's mostly being questioned at the moment. And there's this idea of anthropomorphism. So it's kind of projecting human-like behaviors onto non-human organisms or systems. I thought this was quite a funny image. So yeah, this idea of anthropomorphism. However, really funnily, the the critics actually use this kind of language. So they talk about fungi as market traders and punishers who reward plants that are generous. So actually, the critics that are saying it's too anthropomorphic use the exact same kind of language, which is quite funny. So all these terms are typically attributed to human behaviors. What can you do? So, there's lots of arguments about the true nature of these wood wide webs or these networks underground. But what's undeniable is the complexity and beauty definitely does exist. And mycorrhizal symbioses between plants and fungi are predicted to occur in an estimated 85% of vascular plants on the planet. And in urban areas and urban soils, there are several studies now that show, pollution, light pollution, noise pollution, chemical pollution, all these different kind of things that urban soils have to face and endure. They show that these do really have an effect on mycorrhizal networks. Some studies, there's a bit of conflicting research there, but some studies actually also show that the mycorrhizal fungal networks are really important in enabling trees to endure these stresses as well. So that's a really important thing to consider. So again, the trees aren't just these ornaments, individual entities. They rely deeply on these microbial symbiotic relationships. Again, just bringing you back to that headline, the trees in our cities are dying, a sick microbiome might be to blame. So we've really got to think of the tree as this community. Okay, disclaimer, old cringy reference coming up. Okay, but apart from providing 95% of our food, filtering water, storing carbon, regulating water flow, providing raw materials, decomposing waste, producing medicines and supporting infrastructure, what have soils ever done for us? So apart from all that, what about the soil shape our minds? Has anyone ever thought about that? Well, soils give us 95% of the food we eat. And soil health is intimately linked to plant health, as I've mentioned, through these symbiotic relationships. And the quality of the food we eat shapes our gut microbiomes. And our gut health shapes our mental health. So there's this quite nice theory now that soil health is linked to mental health even through various steps, but it's quite compelling. So there's this idea of the microbiota gut-brain axis. So this two-way communication system linking our central nervous system to our gastrointestinal system. And essentially microbes are talking to the brain and vice versa. And the health of the soil is potentially influencing this relationship through direct exposure to microorganisms that may colonize and influence the bodily functions, but also through the quality of our foods as well. And so we set up this consortium called the Grounded Minds Consortium, and we're investigating this quite complex relationship. So we're trying to nourish the soil, gut, and mind connection. So watch this space for more. So we're actually running a series in September called Soil Yourself September, quite crude title, and it'll be all about this concept. So we'll have lots of different speakers from various points in this this kind of system. So there'll be people in public health, people in soil ecology, etc., etc. So stay tuned for more information on that. So what about other health benefits? So what do urban soils, what other health benefits might they provide? Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about immunology now. So we are protected by two nested layers of biodiversity. The microorganisms of the outer layer, so in the soils, in the water, the plants and animals, and the microbes of the inner layer, so the human gut, the skin and airways. And our bodies are colonized by microbes from the outer layer. So again, just keep thinking of this holobiont concept. So our cells with this walking, talking ecosystem, a host plus trillions of microbes working symbiotically to form this functioning ecological unit. We're constantly emitting, so each one of you watching this is emitting 1 million biological particles every single hour, but we're also ingesting and inhaling them as well. And soils play a really important role. I mentioned they're feeding the air, what we call the aerobiome. So all the different particles and the microbes that we're exposed to on a daily basis, many of them come from urban soils. Now, Graham Rook, he's a famous immunologist from London. He likens the human immune system at birth to a computer system. So he says, at birth, we have the hardware in place, and this is analogous to the cellular structures of our immune system. He also says we have the software in place, which is analogous to the genes that encode for functions that allow our, encode for proteins, sorry, that allow our immune systems to function. But he says the one thing we lack at birth, much like a computer needs to work, is data. So the immune system lacks data at birth. And the data he's referring to is many different kinds of microorganisms as possible. So we need to be exposed to as many different species of microbes to train for three main reasons, really. So one is to train what's called our adaptive immune system. And so we need to be exposed to lots of different species, and we build up these tiny armies of memory immune cells. And we build a repertoire of what we know we've been exposed to. And this allows us to mount a much more efficient immune response when we do encounter pathogens. The second reason is what's called the old friends hypothesis. So this is the idea that we've co-evolved with certain kinds of microorganisms over thousands of years, and they've played a really important role in shaping and regulating what's called our innate immune system. And this is also known as non-specific immunity. And so in the absence of proper regulation by these old friends microorganisms, the innate immune system will attack ordinarily innocuous substances, things like dust and pollen, and even our own cells as well. And that's what manifests as an autoimmune disorder. So we need to be exposed to lots of organisms, particularly from the soil, for instance, to train and regulate our immune system. And then the third reason is what we call the competitive exclusion principle in ecology. So having a diverse microbiome, which is seeded from the environment and from our food, etc., plays an important role in kind of outcompeting on opportunistic pathogens, for instance. There's this kind of no room at the inn effect. So just to summarize, we need to be exposed to lots of different microorganisms from natural environments to train our adaptive immune system, regulate our innate immune system, and then there's this no room at the inn effect of having a diverse microbiome, plus all the other functions that microbes play in the body, many of them. I mentioned no room at the inn, but it's actually more like no room at the dining table. So this study here a couple of years ago or last year showed that having a diverse microbiome actually protects against pathogens by nutrient blocking. So this diagram illustrates that point nicely. So having a diverse microbiome means you've got a higher colonization resistance. And this is because the microbes that are well established in your microbiome are consuming the nutrients that would otherwise be available for pathogens. Okay, so this walking, talking ecosystem basically falling apart all the time, but also rebuilding ourselves through these microscopic interactions. And this, in constant flux of our natural environment, and this is a key reason why the quality of our natural environments and soil health, importantly, because it feeds the environment, is a key determinant of our health. So this is the biodiversity or the old friends hypothesis. So we've moved more away from our biodiverse ancestral environments towards more mechanized, highly urbanized environments where we're less exposed to the natural biodiversity that we should be exposed to. And the idea is that we've seen this decline in biodiversity. So we're actually seeing two global megatrends at the moment that are concurrent. So the decline in biodiversity and then a huge rise in immune disorders as well. And we think these two are intimately linked. So decline in biodiversity leads to a microbial deprivation and disturbed immune response, and then a higher risk of these inflammatory diseases. But, we can do something about it. So, we need to improve soil health, particularly in our urban environments, well, every environment really. But in urban areas, we can intervene as well. So we've got these biodiversity interventions that are going on at the moment. So this is a nice one in Finland. So they basically took a load of schoolyards and they were quite desolate, so they didn't have much nature in them, natural features. And then they brought in forest floor materials, so the soil and the leaves and plants, etc. And then what they found is that after 27 days, the intervention group, so the one that had all this biodiversity brought into it, the children in that group, their microbiomes on their skin and their gut significantly increased in diversity. And then they also did some immune marker analysis. So they took their blood and saliva, and they found that this was associated with enhanced immune function as well. So this kind of just starts to show that, we can intervene and do something about it. And this actually lasted up to a year later. So they did a long-term study and found similar results. And it had this dual effect. So it boosted the, the diversity of the microbiome. In general, that's considered good. There are some nuances I can talk about afterwards, with alpha diversity, that is. But also what they found is it reduced the relative abundance of pathogens as well. Again, probably through this competitive exclusion principle. This is a couple of studies that I've worked on. So a few years ago on my PhD, we showed that there's vertical stratification in the air column of microorganisms, and this is highly dependent on the soil again. So the urban soils, full of life, absolutely heaving. 99% of all species live in the soil, and it feeds the air column. So this is actually what we're exposed to. Many of them are the microbes from the soil. And actually, the higher diversity is lower down because it's close to the soil, as you would expect. So actually, children, small children, are probably exposed to more diverse microbiomes than adults. Someone else in our lab has done a mouse study, and he basically kind of blasted trace levels of soil biodiversity over these mice using special fans. And he found that it increased the gut microbiome diversity of these mice, and also this was associated with reduced anxiety-like behaviors in the mice as well, which is quite interesting. There's many studies like this going on at the moment, though. Okay, so I'm moving away from the kind of microbes and health concepts and moving more towards restoration and some of the tools that we're developing to improve restoration of soils, mostly of soils. Yeah. So this is ecosystem. This is ecoacoustics. Sorry, soil ecoacoustics. So this is the idea that we can, use special microphones and recording equipment to literally listen to the kind of metaphorical heartbeat of the soil. So this metaphorical heartbeat is actually the soil organisms that are moving around and generating little vibrations that we can detect. So that's pretty cool. So we're actually listening to Mother Earth, really. So we're using these microphones to detect soil organisms, and we can use this as a proxy for how healthy the soil is. So we've shown that we can tell the difference between restored soils and degraded soils simply by recording the soundscape of these soils. So we use these what we call acoustic indices. So we basically get a snapshot of this complete soundscape of the soil that's generated by all these different organisms moving around. And then the higher the complexity of the soundscape generally correlates with a healthier soil. So it's pretty cool. So it's a bit like going to your doctor. You probably don't want to see this guy, but imagine them putting a stethoscope on your chest and listening to your heart and your lungs. We're kind of doing a similar thing for the soil. So it's really useful in things like soil diagnostics, soil health diagnostics. And we're hoping to advance this further so we can really use it as a robust way to monitor soil restoration. I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear this, but I'll play it for a second. I won't go too long just in case you can't hear it. But if you can hear it, it's basically the sounds of earthworms moving around in the soils, and it should sound kind of bubbly and clicky and poppy. But I'll stop it there just in case you can't. I'll move on. So these are a couple of figures from another study in the soil ecoacoustics realm, how we're just creating different kind of tools that we can detect soil organisms. So there's this detection plate that we're using. We've actually showed that we can tell the difference between things like snails and worms and spiders and what else? Beetles, between these kind of taxonomic groups simply by listening to them with special microphones, because they've all got slightly different appendages and morphologies, etc. So they give us slightly different acoustic signals. And then I'm just going to move into the world of what we're calling sonic restoration. So this is the idea, so we're listening to the sound of the earth to try and, give a diagnostic of the health of the soil. But we're also applying sound now as well. So we've experimented with playing sounds, literally playing sounds to plant growth promoting fungi, so these microbes. And as this New Scientist article says, fungi grow faster when you play sounds to them. So, humans, we absolutely covered in tiny little receptors, mechanoreceptors. And so we have certain kinds of receptors or cells that detect high frequency vibrations and certain ones that detect low frequency vibrations. And this gives us our kind of perception of touch. In plants and in microbes, they don't have these mechanoreceptors, but they do have what's called mechanosensitive channels. And so they actually respond to a mechanical pressure and the sound wave is actually mechanical pressure. So sound is just a vibration that's propagated as an acoustic wave for a particular medium. So it's actually physically moving particles. So it's a mechanical pressure. And so the membranes of fungi and other microbes, they're likely responding to these sound waves. These mechanical waves are deforming the membranes of these fungi and activating what's called ion channels, which causes an influx of ions into the cell and creates an electrical impulse. So this is often known in the human realm as an action potential. And then we think this is leading to intracellular changes, so changes within the cells, potentially at the gene level. So it might be turning on and off genes that are responsible for growth or productivity, etc. So this is more hypothetical, but it's kind of what we're trying to understand and what we assume is happening. So the bottom line is we played sound to fungi, and you see the top 3 rows here. These are the ones that received the acoustic stimulation, and we played them in petri dishes. And then the bottom 3 rows did not, and you can see quite a significant difference in the coloration of the petri dishes. And the reason the top ones are green is because that's the spores of the what we call the trichoderma fungi. So the spores are actually bright green, so it's really easy to tell the difference as well. So yes, fungi actually respond to sounds in positive ways. So now we're trying to develop this further to see if we can essentially build like a biodiversity jukebox of sounds to see if we can help speed up the restoration process in soil. Oh, I forgot I left this one in. This is just a joke, that we often say we should get students to pick their kind of favorite music genre, and then we play them to microbes to see which one has the most beneficial effect. So it could be a death metal versus a funky looking Mozart. I think that's Mozart. So yeah, this is the idea of creating nature soundscapes as well. So it's quite a thriving field at the moment. So literally playing soundscapes of thriving ecosystems to degraded ecosystems to speed up the restoration process. And some of the people in Adelaide have had really quite huge success with that on oyster beds at the moment. So playing the soundscapes of natural soundscapes to oyster beds that are degraded sped up the colonization of oysters by something like 18 times. So it's quite mind-blowing. And then this is just to illustrate, this is something that I'm working on in another grant application. So we're trying to understand whether noise pollution, so there's a huge rise of noise pollution at the moment, rates faster than population growth, due to industrial activities and urbanization, etc. But we think it potentially could have a negative impact on the soil and the soil organisms as well. And so we've put in a grant application to assess the effects of noise pollution on soil life, particularly in urban areas. So fingers crossed for that. And then I just want to leave you this phrase again. So one I like to use: all the nature we can see intimately depends upon all the nature we can't see. And that's everything I have for today. So thank you for watching. Happy to take questions.
That was absolutely amazing, Jake. I'm buzzing with all your ideas. That is so fantastic. I hope everyone else has enjoyed it as much as I have.
Thanks.
We've got some questions in the chat. Michaela has said, have you listened to Quality Compost? I imagine it's very loud.
Oh, right. Yes. So I don't know if anyone actually heard the sound that I played. I didn't want to play it for too long in case no one heard it. But yeah, so when you listen to things like compost, it's quite bubbly and, crackly and poppy, those kind of sounds. And that's mostly the earthworms moving around and just generating slightly kind of subtle vibrations that we can detect with these highly sensitive microphones. So yeah, we haven't done a study on compost yet, but it's be certainly interesting to do.
Our Anthony says, Jake, you're clearly working at the cutting edge of science, but if a local group wanted to translate some of your ideas into the next project plan, where should they start?
Yeah, so I mean, many people have been contacting us actually. It's quite funny. People seem to love the sound thing as well. It seems to capture the imagination quite a lot. So I mean, a lot of the equipment that we use for the sound stuff, it's not very expensive. So we're trying to develop these kind of SOPs or these, these operation procedures so that different kind of groups can use them. So it might spend quite a lot of money, and that might be more at the the highly complex research end. But then for people that are doing citizen science, you don't have to actually spend that much. So it's just use a basic recorder, a piezo microphone. So I can provide the kind of list of equipment if anyone's interested in doing that kind of stuff. So yeah, you can listen to the sounds of soils relatively cheaply if you want to. And what else? with the microbiome stuff. So that is quite expensive still, to do microbiome sequencing. So it's something like $50 per sample for a basic, what we call 16S amplicon sequencing analysis. So this gives you an idea of who's living in the soil at that microscopic level. You have to spend more for understanding what their functional genes, the roles of their genes play in the ecosystem. That's something more like $200 to $400 per sample. So it's quite expensive still, but it's really falling in price year by year, really. So I reckon maybe in 5 years or so, then things like microbiome sequencing will be much more affordable for even the general public to do things in their back garden, for instance. But yeah, we're always open to collaborating and helping citizen scientists out. So if you feel like getting in touch, feel free to email me.
Thank you. I'm sure people definitely will. Lots of thank yous for a great presentation. And then Rowena says, how fascinating. What are some calls to action for enthusiastic gardeners?
Yeah, good idea. So I mean, oftentimes we're putting things into the soil that we don't really know if it's going to have a good effect or not. We might be, adding more nutrients than it needs. So you can actually do a basic, what we call physical chemical analysis of the soil. It costs like $40 to $50. So it's not super expensive. So you could kind of understand the baseline conditions of your soil before you start, doing too much to it. And, I can provide the details for where you get that analysis done. What else? Yeah, just try and learn more about the microbiome really, because it's super integral to the soil health and the health of the plants as well. So read as many papers as you can. We're trying to, translate the findings into a bit more intelligible format soon. So I'm actually starting a podcast soon about the, ecosystem health, how that affects human health, particularly through the microbiome lens. So hopefully that will give people some pointers too.
Thank you. We have Anna says, we're a grassroots organisation in an ex-industrial area along the inner urban Yarra. Can you speak briefly to reconstructing post-wild, highly altered, degraded urban soils, essentially industrial infill, bridge reconstruction, rubble, etc., to improve soil structure and ecological improvement? We are keen to harness this expertise
Yeah, wow.
to what we do.
Yeah, that's a good one. I've not actually been involved in that kind of reconstruction, although I know someone in our lab is actually working on that right now. But we're actually working on the idea, how if you heard of Miyawaki forests, how people are creating these tiny forests, etc., and trying to enrich the soil. Just that soil enrichment process, we're trying to look at that in these kind of these industrial kind of wildscape areas where the soil's potentially full of all sorts of crap. So there's not actually been loads of research on that at the moment. It is ongoing, so I can't really comment too much on how exactly to do it, but people are working on it. Again, if you want to drop me an email, I can potentially point you in the right direction. But again, kind of looking at the physical chemical components is a really good start. So just understanding what is there in the first place, you can send off a $40, $50 sample to understand, the baseline conditions of the soil, particularly the physical and the chemical components, which is really important to understand, things like what microbial inoculants you can start to develop, or what kind of organic matter you need to put into the soil.
Claire is asking, do they like singing?
What microbes or
Microbes, Claire, or fungi, or
it's a good question, to be honest, because there's been a couple of studies.
Microbes.
Microbes, yeah, right.
Yeah, singing microbes.
Well, there's been a couple of studies that show that, that suggest that noise can actually influence the gut microbiome as well. So it's likely that things that we've been listening to throughout our life course has shaped our microbiomes in our body as well. So yeah, if you're a singer, you probably are having an influence on your microbes, on your skin and in your gut for sure.
Cool.
I suspect. I mean, it hasn't been studied, but I suspect so. Yeah. So they respond to vibrations of all different kinds. It's quite a really fascinating topic, isn't it? Because there's this growing issue of noise pollution, and we don't really think much of it. We find it annoying when we might put earplugs in, but it's potentially having a much deeper effect on our bodies through our microbes.
Loads more people saying thank you for a fantastic presentation.
No worries, thanks.
Michaela, again from Yimby Compost, who would love to supply compost if you ever do a study on compost.
Awesome.
It would be a great way to show the variation in quality in compost being produced. For example, quality backyard compost that we produce versus BOGO compost.
Sounds good. Yeah, feel free to get in touch. There's various people in our lab working on all sorts of different kind of things. So some people might want to engage.
People would love, Rowena's asked for the details of your podcast when it's ready.
Yeah, so it'll be on YouTube. So yeah, I'll send you details.
Right, we can forward that to everyone that's attended today.
Thanks.
Pascal has said, given that children need to build their gut biome for immune defense and they're closest to the soil biodiversity due to size, what research do you have to share where we can advocate against plastic grass and biodiversity?
Good question. Again, there's not tons of research on the grass and the microbiome impacts. It's a bugbear of mine, though. I hate plastic nature. It's so annoying. I was in the UK a few months ago, and there are now plastic hedgerows. Oh my god. Anyway, but there's a couple of studies that look at specific pathogens in plastic grass and astroturf, etc. And there's some suggestions that it could increase things like MRSA bugs, etc. So maybe look for those. I haven't looked at the most recent research if there is any, but yeah, I agree. It's a really important topic. And, something like, I wrote in my book, it's something like 1.5 times the size of Barbados in area is the landmass that's increasing, I think annually or every 10 years, of plastic grass and astroturfs and things in people's yards. So just imagine the problem it's going to cause in like 10 years when half the planet is plastic. Annoying.
Advocacy to be done.
Yeah.
Rowena's asking about whether biodynamic fertilizing using liquid compost, fish emulsion, seaweed and microbiology, is it helpful or not?
Yeah, again, so I mean, people putting lots of things in their soil without understanding those baseline conditions. So if you might already have lots of nutrients in there and you might not need to do things. There's some evidence that suggests these kind of things work. The same with inoculants. There's lots of things on the market that it's a bit of a wild west. So knowing exactly what to use, that it's a bit about doing some experimenting with yourself. There's evidence that microbial inoculants, we call them microbial inoculants. I mean, in some forms, yeah, you could consider them as liquid compost or compost teas, etc. There's plenty of evidence in the agricultural sector that shows it does improve various aspects of soil health. But again, it's quite a reactive process. So it's a bit like us taking drugs in a way to fix health problems, where we really need to come at it from a more holistic approach and restore ecosystems so that we take a more preventative approach. Same with our health, really. It's very reactive. So it's not the be all and end all. There's no real silver bullet, I'm afraid.
Just so everyone knows, Carol has popped Jake's website in the chat. Alison says, thanks, Jake. Sounds like we need to start with analysis. Where do you suggest we send soil samples? Mary suggested agpath.com.au.
Yes,
do you have a suggestion?
Yeah, so what's the one in Perth we use? Something like CBPS, I think it's called. So they do the physical chemical analysis. So yeah, understanding things like the soil texture and the nutrient levels and pH, etc. So there's various labs across the country, but they're quite cheap. It's like $40 or $50 per sample. And then if you want to understand what's living in there, the microorganisms, etc. So this will cost quite a bit more, but there's a company called AGRF, and there's a company called SAGC. These do the microbial kind of metagenomics analysis. They can tell you who's living in the soil, and then if you want to pay a bit more, they can tell you what their kind of functional roles are, so some of their genes as well. So there's a few organizations that do this kind of thing. Yeah, some universities offer it as well.
Does anyone have any more questions, or just pop their hand up and have a chat? Rowena's asked if you could please send out notes detailing those.
Sure, I'll just type two of them in the chat. And SAGC to do microbiome analysis.
Saying Vic EPA does free soil contamination testing.
Yeah, there's probably plenty in the state of Victoria as well. So those two are just SA based. We mostly do our own microbiome analysis though in-house, but yeah, that's when we're doing big research projects so we can get grant funding to actually pay for it. sorry, I can't do free analysis. I wish I could.
No. All right. Are there any more questions from our audience? Just want to remind everyone to grab a copy of any of Jake's books, Treewilding, Invisible Friends, and The Nature of Pandemics. Is that coming out in 2025?
Should be, yeah. So it should be around in, I'm assuming, kind of September time, that one. Yeah. So it's quite a perspective shifting book. You know, considering that, you know, animals are going through pandemics as well. So we're always focused on humans, but there's a lot of, that's basically the idea of the nature of pandemics. So the idea of what's going to cause the next pandemic in humans, but then also a recognition that, you know, millions and millions of animals are dying of pandemics that we just don't talk about in the news. And a lot of this is to do with ecosystem degradation and climate change, etc. So, but it's also quite, you know, towards the last section of the book is hopeful and solutions focused, not doom and gloom.
Thank you so much. If nobody else has anything, I'd like to thank you, Jake, on behalf of the VEFN and all our attendees and the wider community for such a brilliant, fascinating talk. It's given us so much to think about, and yeah, we'll be buzzing for hours to come, I'm sure. We really appreciate you being here tonight. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks.
Thank you. See you later.